So what is the practical expedient provided by IND AS 116 to the lessee? A practical expedient in simple sense means relief. So this relief is an optional exemption given to the lessee. The lessee is provided with some relief. What relief? A relief saying that, a practical expedient saying that the lessee need not separate a lease and non-lease component. But for applying this exemption, for applying this practical expedient, then the company or the lessee should make an accounting policy to treat all such similar underlying asset in the same manner. That means you cannot apply practical expedient in one case and not apply in another case. That is not possible. You will have to apply this practical expedient as an accounting policy to all the similar underlying assets. Clear? So let's try to understand, because it's very simple. I just told you what it is. The relief is that the lessee need not combine or need not separate or distinguish between the lease and non-lease component. He can combine the non-lease components into the lease and recognize it under IND AS 116. This is a practical expedient exemption which is provided only to the lessee. Put a heading. Optional exemption using practical expedient. Optional exemption using practical expedient. To not separate non-lease components This is the practical expedient. It is the optional exemption using practical expedient to not separate the non-lease components from the lease, from the contract. What is this which I am talking about? So let's understand what is this optional exemption using practical expedient to not separate the non-lease component. So whenever I am talking about this logic, it says that as per IND AS 116, what am I saying? Practical expedient is a relief on not to separate the non-lease component, and they can be recognized as a single element of lease. Even though it includes a non-lease component, you can recognize it under IND AS 116. The practical expedient, which is nothing but a relief, guys, just writing in brackets, it is relief that permits expedient, guys, content that permits lessees to make an accounting policy. Make an accounting policy. What accounting policy will they make? Election by class of underlying asset like I told you, it is an accounting policy which applies to a particular class of underlying asset to account for each lease component together with a non-lease component in the contract as a single component, as a single lease component What do you mean by this? Look at what I've written. IND AS 116 provides a practical expedient or a relief. Whom is this relief available to? This relief is only available to my lessee. Only the lessee can use it. What is the lessee using? The lessee's relief is that he can make an accounting policy. This accounting policy shall be applicable to the class of underlying asset to treat or to account for each lease component together with non-lease components in the contract as a single lease component under IND AS 116. By the meaning, I mean to say that you need not separate the lease and non-lease components in the contract for the purpose of recognizing a contract under IND AS 116. Please take down. I'll try to write it. I'll tell you what is the consequence of this, and I'll also tell you a statement that it is not available to lessor. IND AS 116 provides a practical expedient which permits the lessee to make an accounting policy, to elect for a class of underlying asset, to account the lease component together with non-lease components as a single lease component under IND AS 116. What is the consequence of this? I'll tell you what is the consequence. The consequence of this approach, as a consequence, the entire consideration should be included as lease rentals. Therefore, there is an increased lease liability recognized by lessee. I'll talk about this lease liability, guys. How do I measure it? But I am saying that 100% the lease liability recognized by the lessee will increase as a consequence of this, because the entire consideration is not separated between lease and non-lease components. Entire thing is combined together to be considered as a single lease component. So whatever discussion that we made earlier regarding separation of lease and non-lease components and the proportion of their standalone selling prices is no longer required when I am applying this practical expedient, but this should be applied as an accounting policy for a class of underlying assets. Clear? Get the logic? Write that statement. This relief or practical expedient should apply as an accounting policy to all contracts for similar class of assets. For similar class of assets. All similar classes of assets should be considered in the same accounting policy, whether you want to separate it or you don't want to separate. You have to elect and select and apply the same accounting policy for the same similar class of assets. However, such exemption is not available to lessor. Lessor has to separate between the lease and non-lease component. For him, there is no particular exemption. He will have to apply the same paragraph that we read through earlier. He has to identify the lease and non-lease component in the contract, separate them on the basis of their standalone selling prices. He can apply the paragraphs of IND AS 115 to determine this, and this is what a lessor does. Only lessee has this exemption available, and this is provided as a relief or a practical expedient under IND AS 116. As a consequence of applying this accounting policy to not separate the non-lease component from the lease component and treating it as a single lease element, there will be a significant increase in the lease liability recognized by the lessee. Clear? That will bring us to the end of discussion on three aspects. Number one, separation of each lease component in a contract when a contract contains more than one underlying asset. Combination of various contracts which are entered into at the same time or near the same time for different underlying assets. Third one, where there is a separation between the lease and non-lease components, how should the consideration be allocated to the non-lease components and the lease components and recognized? And last, we have concluded by using the word practical expedient or a relief, which is offered as an exemption by selecting an accounting policy for similar class of assets available to lessee. Only the lessee can use it. Lessor cannot apply this practical expedient. That will bring us to the end of a significant aspect of the standard, because from here on we can start looking at elements or items which are required for recognition and measurement. We have laid a perfect path towards the standard. Now we are very much ready to look at recognition and measurement. So that will be our next session as far as your recognition and measurement is concerned. But remember, before we touch recognition and measurement, we have to look at certain elements or certain definitions, certain components which we will use it in understanding our recognition and measurement. So this will bring us to the end of a significant aspect of the standard.